See, today is Buddha Purnima, so I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit on him, and it's very interesting in the concept, in the context of what we did also, all about memory. And now, Buddha Purnima is a very interesting day in that Buddha is supposed to be born on that day, he attained enlightened on that day, and he attained nirvana also on that day. So it's a great convenience. You can celebrate all the significant events. You don't have to have three different. So very obviously, it's a later sort of maybe cultural development. Though Purnima, the full moon day, does have certain difference in the way the energy rises. The energy spontaneously tends to rise very swiftly on Purnima. Rather like the full moon, it causes the tides to rise. So, and lunacy. Lunacy comes from Luna, the moon, anyways. But Purnima does have that. The full moon does have that tendency to cause the bioenergy or the internal energy to rise. So it's not surprising that he attained enlightenment on the Purnima and that he attained Nirvana also on the Purnima. That's quite. Now, the Buddha's story is so significant to the history of the world, because it is the first world religion. Before any other religion, it was the first religion that spread out all over the world. There was a brief period of time when from China to what is today Egypt, Buddhism had spread across the entire. Never managed to go to Europe because by the time it got wiped out, Europe and America had got to them only in the 20th century. But it was in many ways the most important world religion. And it is so easily accessible to local cultures, which is why Buddhism has so many different flavors. Sri Lankan Buddhism is very different from Japanese Buddhism, which is very different from Burmese Buddhism. Now, all of them, it seems to be able to maintain the authenticity of the spiritual transformation while adapting to the local culture. It's a very unique thing about. It's a very, very unique thing about Buddhism. So, we won't have time to talk about all the many things that Buddha did. So, I'll just take one strand, one very significant shift in consciousness that he created, or a very significant shift that he created in spiritual processes, in sadhana, those kind of things. See, first of all, we must understand that this whole mythological story of him being a prince is not historically true. That's a myth. He was a Kshatriya, pretty high status, but they were just a Mahajanapada. They were just like a republic. He was just a pretty high official's son. It was later on when they started making the myths that he was a royal family and those kind of things. So historically that is not true. Mahavira was from a royal family. Mahavira was indeed from a kingdom. He was not from a republic. Buddha was from a republic, so he could not have been a prince. It was only later when the myth started up that. Secondly, this thing about Buddha being one of the avatars of Vishnu, that also is a very, very, very late interpolation into the Hindu faith. At the time when Buddhism was a challenge to Hinduism, the avatar of Buddha was actually regarded as an avatar taken to delude what were demonic rulers. And so if you actually read how the Buddha avatar is mentioned in the Vishnu Purana and all the Puranas of the time, it is not the Buddha of Buddhism. It is an aspect of Vishnu that has taken form to delude people and teach them that there is nothing but the body. So it's a rather unpleasant story. Once after Adi Shankara and everything, around the 12th, 13th century, when Hinduism had completely assimilated Buddhism had dwindled and become practically extinct. After that, the mainstream story of Buddha became the. So the story of Buddha as the Buddhists know it is not the story as the Hindus know it. That is one of the most important things that most people don't know, and people get very upset about it also, but there is no point lying about it. The truth of the matter is Hindus and Buddhists did not like each other. It was a constant competition, and for various historical reasons the Hindus assimilated, which is quite an extraordinary thing to do actually. There is a world religion in this, and the original religion reabsorbs it back into the body. So after having said all these things, nevertheless the Buddha story is quite interesting, because if we look at the mythological story of the Buddha, what was done to him was completely insane. His dad decides that my son will never know anything of human suffering. He will never know that there is a thing called disease. He will never know that there is a thing called decay or old age or death. So much so that if he was going to walk in the garden, they would sweep the garden beforehand because he should not see dead leaves and dead flowers. As anybody with any kind of psychological knowledge could have predicted, if you push somebody in one direction, they push right back the opposite direction. This experiment was actually tried again in the 20th century. Aurobindo's father, his name is not even Aurobindo Ghosh, Sri Aurobindo. His actual name that his father gave him was Ackroyd, because his father was a big Anglophile and he did not want. And when he was sent for education in England, it was with the express instruction that they are not to have any contact with any Indians or anything Indian. He didn't even know any Indian language till he was 22, 23, and he'd come back to India. And that man became the greatest enemy of the British Empire. So anytime you overdo in one direction, the normal tendency of nature to balance it out. So Buddha is kept from what any child would know, and he becomes a fully adult man, and he still doesn't know that bad things happen. And so when he goes out with his charioteer that day and he sees old age, and he sees suffering, and he sees pain, and he sees poverty, he sees disease, he sees death, the shock is too great. What would have been something that impressed itself on the resilient consciousness of a child is now hitting the fully formed consciousness of an adult. So the shock was simply too much. Now I do not know if it was physically possible, but perhaps it's true. There are people who are so cosseted, they have no clue as to how things actually function in the real world. They are so cosseted by their luxury and their position, so they don't know what actually happens. And when he ran up against that, he had unlike almost all of us who see these things when we are small, we see dead people, we see illness, we see old people, we see feeble people. It was very unique in that he had no childish or childlike defenses against it. The way children come to terms with these things and they accept it, and they are told some story that, oh, the person went to heaven, or the person is now happy somewhere bounding about on a farm. He had none of those stories. He had none of those defenses that we all grow up with. So the shock of how the world actually functions was too much. He went almost mad he went almost insane with the sheer enormity of what he was experiencing for the first time. His mom died 7 days after giving birth to him. I think they kept that also from him. Because basically he was brought up by his aunt, and when he finally runs up against the fact of existence, that existence is not the cushy, comfortable thing. And why did his father do that? Because if he knows that there is pain in the world, he will go and try to find a solution for it. I want him to be a great Chakravarti Samrat. I don't want him to be a great master. I don't want him to be a great spiritual teacher. But life is what it is. And it's not like he sees those sights and he immediately goes. No, that's also not true, because the stories are very clear that he continues to live in the palace, but now he's asking questions. He's now observing things. He's seeing things. And he's beginning to have a completely different view of how things play out. It's not the lovely fantasy that I thought, and it's deepening his pain, it's deepening his anguish. And then when his son is born, that is the breaking point for him. Like, if I don't do something at this point, that's it, I'll be stuck. And that is why he names the boy Rahula, because Rahula actually in Sanskrit, it means the chain by which you used to tie the elephant. Today that name has become very popular, Rahul, everybody is called Rahul, but Rahul actually means the chain, the fetter that you used to tie the elephant. What he burst out in his agony that one more chain has been formed, one more Rahul has been created. And his father thought, oh, that means he has accepted his responsibilities, he is accepting, he'll be with his family. That night he runs. And see, this is another thing about the truly evolved people. When their sense of truth manifests, they will do things which from a normal social point are horrible, because he just abandons his wife and his newborn child, and he says there are more important things than that. He's never been forgiven by women ever since. He also didn't have a very high opinion of women. When women wanted to join the Sangha, he kept saying no, 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 until his cousin Ananda persuaded him, and with great reluctance, and he created such crippling rules of discipline that even if there is somebody, a lady monk who is 80 years old, she is inferior to a male monk who has just taken initiation that day in the Sangha. These are, and he actually says now this faith will remain pure only for 500 years, otherwise it would have lasted for 1,000 years, which is pretty accurate. So he knew something, because all the tantric stuff happened. But he seemed to have been stifled with feminine companionship to an unendurable point, But the fact of the matter is, and you see this, they do, somebody like Krishna, he will just trample on personal relationships if that is what is needed. Even Sri Aurobindo, he just runs from Calcutta, he leaves his wife behind, and whole life she is there. Everybody talks of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who is a French lady, but nobody remembers that he had for many, many years, he had somebody called Mrinalini who he was married to. So that is the hard aspect of people who are in the grip of the evolutionary consciousness that most people do not like to think of, because they will do what needs doing, and if it hurts people in and around them, they calculate the cost and they say that is fine. So of course the Buddha went, he learned from everybody, but he had because he was never educated in these matters, he never learnt the deference that, I have always wondered about why the Buddha would not accept whatever answer he was given, because his father made sure that he was completely innocent of any spiritual talk, of any yogic talk, of any sadhana talk, of any spiritual path talk. Most of the time we start indoctrinating children as, and they come to know puja part, we hear pravachans, they know, we tell them the stories. He came to all these things as an adult, and he would not accept if he found that it did not, because his quest was very simple. There is suffering and one needs to fix it. And all the methods and the teachings that he found that they do not really enable you to transcend suffering or to leave suffering behind, they enable you to manage it. Now, because he was ignorant, or he was purposely kept ignorant of all theological and spiritual and those factors, when he finally engaged with them, he engaged with them from fully adult consciousness. And he was one of the very most brilliant and intelligent men the planet has seen. There is no doubt about that. He was truly one of the biggest brains that the planet has seen. So he could see through those fallacies, and he could see all the spiritual bypassing, which most sadhanas are basically spiritual bypassing. My spiritual bypassing talk, I have spoken on some of them. He could see that no, these are not accurate solutions to the problem of dukkha. Dukkham, dukkham basically means pain, sorrow, suffering, disease, evil, just the sheer horror of being alive. Because he had never known that this lovely life that we have can be snuffed out because you miss your footing and you fall down steps. Something can just hit your head and you can die, or you can catch some kind of disease and you can die. And that everything that is worth living, everything that is so pleasant and comfortable and valuable and good can just be turned off like that. The sheer horror of that injustice, or what he thought, like, just how unfair is this? And again, because he was never told no. As a child, his father never told him no. Whatever he wanted was given to him. So he never had disappointment. When we have disappointments, we become accepting, we kind of adjust and accommodate to the external environment. He never had the need to do that. So again, when he comes as an adult and he is faced with certain situations that what I want will not happen, and whatever I am can be snuffed out just like that. And he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that with this constant horror hovering over everybody's head, people are still living the way they are living. People are still functioning the way they are functioning. It flabbergasted him, it bewildered him. He like, this is impossible. Everything that is valuable and worthwhile can be taken away in just 1 second, and you guys can just be okay about it and just go on pretending that nothing needs to be done about this. So he was a spiritual genius in that he could learn anything. He would go to teachers and he would learn whatever they had to learn, and he would move fast. But each time, because again he did not have that deference. We teach people deference. Oh, that is a spiritual person, so bend. So don't criticize, don't question. He didn't have that deference, so he could tell those teachers no. And he would challenge them directly. He would ask them, what about this? How do we come to this level? And they would say, we don't know. If you find out, please come back and teach us. One or two. Mahakashyapa, who was the most famous spiritual teacher of the time, actually became Buddha's disciple later, because he understood that I am missing something. So this was actually extraordinary, because our country is religion saturated. From the time we are born, we are saturated with religious rites and ceremonies and puja part, and he was deliberately kept away from all of that. Therefore, none of them had any influence on him. It was a very unique upbringing in that way. He just had no investment in it. So he could question, he could question, he could question. It's not like the other paths did not know, but the answer, the Ajivikas, they were fatalists. They were like, everything is already carved in stone, so it doesn't matter. And I explained about the Ajivikas. Their leader at the time was a contemporary of Buddha. He was a wild guy. He was a completely uncontrollable fellow. His name was Ajita Keshakambal. The name itself is a joke because it means invincible hair blanket. And they had lovely initiation ceremonies. If you wanted to be an Ajivika, they'd bury you up to the neck in the ground, and then the teacher would pull your hair out one hair at a time. That was your that was your initiation. And they were supposed to be fatalists, but sometimes they would be caught doing sadhana, and they would be asked, why are you doing these practices? And the answer was, this is also fated. But it was obviously a lie. They obviously had some tendency to become enlightened because they continued up to the 12th century. The Ajivikas continued, and if people are not getting enlightened in your lineage, in your parampara, nobody will be there with you. So obviously this was the public face that they were putting in, that everything is fated. But this, they had really strange and weird things. But this initiation ceremony was the best part. Mahavira, of course, went one step further. He plucked out all his hair in 5 handfuls, and they still do that. They pluck out the hair in 5 handfuls and then they put ash on the head. It's still done today. Now the thing is, the others understood that dukkham happens, suffering happens. They accepted it. Suffering happens, so the Charvaka said, eat, drink and be merry, fornicate, because there is nothing except the grave. The Ajivika said, no matter what you try, it is anyways all scripted. So, everybody had, the Jainas took it to the other extent. Since suffering is there, we will do the most fantastic tapasya. Nobody has done tapasya like the Jains have. The amount of starvation, the amount of, in the Jaina stories, all these people, Ajita Keshakambal, Makali, Gosala, even Siddhartha Gautama, they all come and they ask to be recognized as the Tirthankara, but Tirthankara is the Jain savior. But Mahavira had done the most intense tapasya, so Mahavira became announced. They proclaimed him as the Tirthankara. So the Jains took the other, since this is inevitable, since this suffering is inevitable, we will use it to break through, to transcend. We will use it to break through. But Buddha was like, no, that's not an answer. That's not an answer. It cannot be an answer because he tried. He tried the starvation route, and many famous sculptures you will see the starving Buddha. In fact, in my Sacred India Tarot, one of my suits are entirely the story of the Buddha, and we have the starving Buddha there also. But he saw, yes, of course, if you starve your body, you can come to that 5 of Pentacles. You can come to immense stillness and peace. By imposing that discipline on the body, you can come to but it is a external procedure. Because your mind is at peace, your emotions are at peace, but your body is suffering. His body had come to the state where if he rubbed his hands over his limbs, the hairs would fall off. So he abandoned that whole path of, since suffering is there, I will dive headlong into suffering and make it. That's not the way. So he discovered the way. That's story for some other time, that because he's a unique guy. He's really, because he didn't have the conditioning, that's what I keep saying, because he didn't have the cultural conditioning. First samadhi, he said, this cannot be it, there must be more. Second samadhi, this cannot be it, there must be more. Third samadhi, fourth samadhi, in one night he went through the 8 layers of samadhi. Can you imagine that? Most people even today, they get the first samadhi and they're like, okay, let's start up an organization and start Batoro collecting dakshina. And one of the eightfold path, you know, the Noble Eightfold Path, he actually says Samma Samadhi, correct Samadhi, not incorrect Samadhi. It's one of the. So the man comes back and then he gives his famous first pravachan, which I will play today before we do our meditation. It's awesome thing to hear in the original Pali, in the original language that he used, which is like a slightly stepped down version of Sanskrit, the language of the common people. And that act is called the turning of the wheel of the dharma. You know, that. So the first thing he says, it's really powerful. Idam khopana bhikkhave dukkham marya satyam. Now hear this, O bhikkhus. He had these 5 fellow disciples to whom he gave the first sermon at the deer park in Sarnath. Idam khopana bhikkhave. Now hear this. Idam now. Khopana. Hear this. Dukkham marya satyam. Suffering. So dukkham is the first noble truth. So today I'll just speak on that aspect of suffering, because you know it was his genius to bring that centrality of the human experience and say this cannot be endured. He was the first man to say that. You know, in all other religious striving till then, all other paths till then, they were like, that is God's will, surrender to it, do that. And he was the first person to say, no, this is an affront to human dignity. Why should something so spectacular and so valuable as the human life, capable of such great achievement, capable of such great culture, such happiness, why should it be subject to this death, disease, decay, senility? So of course the answer was very clear. It is because you have desires. When your desires are frustrated, you become either angry or you become sad. You know? So the source of dukkham, the source of the suffering. And he went further. He was the first man, and then it has been repeated ad nauseum. It is one of the ever new, ever old realizations that all intelligent people have, that just because you gratify your desire, you're not going to be happy. You know, even in Leo Tolstoy wrote it in Anna Karenina, you know, that just because you've got what you wanted and now you're like, why is this not making me happy? You know, so people have midlife crises and they buy new cars and they trade in their old spouse for a new one, and it still doesn't make them happy. Because what he realized, and Buddha was the first man to articulate it, the first man to really structure it, the first man to really communicate that this is an inherent flaw in how human beings are designed. If you keep trying to fulfill the desire, you will only, no matter how many achievements you have, you will only end up in the end increasing dukkham, you know, because the tanha, the craving, you know, it deepens your vasana samskara, it deepens your habits and your tendencies, it deepens the growth of your karma. Your whole life you have been doing a particular kind of thing, whether you like it or not, in your next lifetime you will vibrate. So he was the first person, not that desire should not be fulfilled. Now, you know, most places they tell you that desire is the enemy, so block your desire. All that leads to is frustration and hypocrisy. So what I tell people is, you have the desire, there is no point. You have to fulfill it sometime or the other, might as well do it now. Don't add to your desires, don't increase your desire. So, you know, you actually seriously sit down for a couple of days, okay, these are all the things I want in life. These are just futile and foolish, it's actually just airy-fairy notion of mind, let it go. But these are things I really, really want. Do something to make that true. And then don't add to it. Then because you see your friend has something or because you saw it on TV, don't add to your desire, because then you're creating trouble. But the desires that are already there, there is no point fighting them, they have to be dealt with. They have to be fulfilled sometime or the other. Because dukkha for him was something that, there was that famous fire sermon that he gave. It's really interesting to read his fire sermon because he got into such an agitation over it. Everything is aflame, the eye is on fire, forms are on fire, consciousness at the eye is on fire. Aflame with what? The fire of passion, the fire of aversion, the fire of delusion. On fire, I tell you, with birth, aging, death, with sorrow and lamentation and pain. You know, to him, all input can lead to more desire leads to more dukkha. You look at something, you want that. You smell something, you want that. You hear something, you want that. So that is why his meditations are all about just being more and more aware of yourself. The whole Vipassana meditation, just follow the breath, just basically cut away all stimuli. If you look at the way Vipassana is done, it just basically cuts away all stimuli, because he understood that stimuli is the way desire comes in. And once desire comes in, all desires will never be fulfilled. That will lead to frustration. Frustration leads to anger. Anger leads to your doing stupid things. Then it leads to sorrow and repentance. And it leads to deepening of your karmic groove and the whole vicious cycle. So he was the first person. He was the first person to understand this. He was the first person to understand how our desires, not the first person to understand, but the first person to make it central. The first person to make it central in the sadhana. Instead of coming to a place, of course, it's not like he didn't stop it because he was going around making everybody take sannyasa straight away until his father had to put an end to it. What is this nonsense? You won't leave a single male alive in the whole Kapilavastu. But he was the first person, and then yoga picked it up. Then yoga also picked up this thing of, yes, this dealing with the dukkham is the important thing. Because he asked very clearly, what is the use of the liberation, or what is the use of the process if it doesn't make a person happy? And then the Hindus took that concept further and they came to the notion of Ananda, that you can go to a place within you, you can access a zone of consciousness of pure bliss, which makes ordinary normal happiness look like ditch water. But Buddha was a person who changed gear in the culture. He was a person who shifted that, and he said, it is unacceptable to be suffering like this. A human being should not have to suffer like this. Now the answer still then was, that is your karma. Endure it, see it through, or come to terms with it, or suppress it, or bypass it. Or he was the first man to put it right in the center and say, this is the reality of the human condition. What do we do? And everybody, the Hindus, the Jains, everybody had to turn around and accommodate that new understanding or that new insight. They had to come to that point where, yes, a life of sorrow and suffering, even today that old argument is still there. It makes you more spiritual. No, it doesn't. Normally, pain, sorrow and suffering only worsens your character. It makes you very vicious, it makes you very spiteful, it makes you very bitter, it makes you very angry. Pain, sorrow and suffering are overvalued as, yes, it brings you to spirituality, that is true, that much I will concede. That until people start suffering, they don't start thinking of something deeper, because even if everything seems to be going well in life, somebody is born quite affluent, somebody is, the relationships are nice, the pets are okay, there is no problem, life seems to be going, but if they sit with themselves, they can't sit with themselves. So we may not be aware of this, but so many lifetimes we have been carrying suffering. Suffering is the centrality of our existence. And if you say it is a comedy movie, it is instantly taken as less serious. Whereas if it is a tragedy, oh, it must be more valuable from a cultural point of view, from a psychological point of view. That's how deep it is. That if you are laughing, it is of less value. Yeah. In all aesthetic theory, if you put your focus, your lens on deprivation and loss and pain and war and the grimness of life, that is regarded as being more mature and more adult, more valuable. And what makes you happy, what makes you smile, that's childish, yes? Because that's how deep it is. The first thing that happens in meditation, I keep saying this, nobody listens to me. Then when they experience it, I get frantic phone calls and emails and SMSs. Whenever you are sitting in meditation, the first thing that gets processed is lifetimes of grief. All the grief that to manage we have been suppressing and repressing, that starts coming out, and without your knowing it, you're crying. Now, many people say that let go of it. You can't let go of it. It has to be worked through. It cannot be dropped. It is not luggage you are carrying. It is completely intrinsic. Now, this is, I think, Buddha's greatest contribution. He did not say that the suffering is external. He did not prescribe methods whereby you deal with the suffering as some kind of suitcase that is locked to you and you find the right tool and you can cut it away. He was the first person to say, no, it is intrinsic, you are carrying it with you, lifetimes of lifetimes. Dukkham Mariya Satyam. The first noble truth is the fact of suffering, the fact of dukkham, sorrow. That is the nature of the human life, and that is not what human lives were supposed to be, because he was completely, you see, even somebody like Krishna, even somebody like Aurobindo, they all keep saying that sorrow is not what human life is meant to be. Everybody who is fighting for evolutionary consciousness keeps coming back to this. But we must acknowledge that that is what we are at the moment. That is what we value, that is what we take seriously. How many great TV serials or movies which are comedies or which are like, do we call as classic movies? All the classic movies are always grim, yes? And Buddha was the first person to realize that, because that is the nature of the human existence. And all sadhanas after that could not do what they were doing, because all the sadhanas, even now those sadhanas exist, but the fact is Buddhism has brought this issue to the forefront of consciousness, so it has to be dealt with. Even now it is doing the bypass. Oh, suffering is inevitable, it is punishment for previous lifetime sin, surrender to God, surrender to the Guru, let it be, and we work our way through it. But he did not allow it to be bypassed. He brought it right. Here is human existence. Human existence is suffering. What are we going to do about it? And all responses, even psychotherapy and all that, they are basically responses to that one fundamental question. People are suffering, what do we do about it? This was extraordinary. That time also was extraordinary, because all over the world spiritual giants were erupting. It was just a most unusual time, 6th century BC. But where everybody was prescribing sort of accommodation to suffering, he was the first person who said, no, suffering must be got rid of. And here is the way to do it. I find that to be amazing. Because that is an adult thing, and like I said, because he was never conditioned as an adult, as a child rather, he was never conditioned to value and accept all the givens of the culture, all the theological givens, all the spiritual givens. He had this completely, startlingly fresh way of looking at things. Amazingly fresh way of looking at things. Now, while he did understand all the past life karma and the reasons why, he was never interested. This is the other extraordinary thing. He was never interested in the why. Like, you are suffering, yes? Let us find a way to get you out of your suffering. Even today, this question is, why is this happening to me? Is it a past life thing? Is there some Rinanubandhan there? Is there some Vasana Samaskara there? So when he was tired of this question, he said, you remind me of a person who has been hit by an arrow and has tumbled into the river. Yeah? So somebody is trying to pull you out, and that time you're like, no, first find out the caste of the person who shot that arrow. Yeah? But did that have a bone point or a stone point or an iron point, or was it a wooden point? Was it poisoned? Yeah? Once you answer all these questions, then I will let you pull the arrow out. No, you've been hit by the arrow and you're drowning. The thing is to get you onto shore and to pull the arrow out of you. All these reasons why are interesting things, and if you sit in meditation, the answers will come. If you sit in meditation, all your past lives are revealed to you. And there's nothing, it's quite boring, and most of the time, you're not somebody famous. Whenever somebody comes out of meditation with the announcement that they were somebody famous in a previous lifetime, 99.9% of the time they are in delusion. And he knew that this delusion is very typical of the human being, which is why he did not encourage this. He never encouraged the why. He was only interested in the how. Right, this is what our situation is, how do we move forward? So that very practical thing was again a huge gift, because the Indian mind, and that time towns and villages used to have tarka bhavans. They had these halls where somebody could come from outside, sit in the bhavan and say, I am here to have a debate with whoever is the intellectual of the town or the village. Every town, every village had one place for tarka. And he was like, stop it. As long as you keep asking why, you will never get rid of it. So why is of course sometimes interesting, but it's besides the point. So again he did that. He changed the whole course of the culture. He changed the whole course of the sort of practices and the sort of because it might not appear so. We are lucky people. We are part of the 1 or 2% of India because of the nature of our lives. It might not appear so to us, but we suffer too. And until you get really deep into sadhana, you do not realize how much suffering there is. Because to function, we keep that knowledge, which all of us have, but we keep that knowledge somewhere. We are in denial about that knowledge, that all of this can vanish in just 1 second. So the Kapalikas, they would walk around with a human skull in their hand, because this is the ultimate fate, and they would eat in that also. They would eat in that skull. That this is what is the fate of the human being. This is the end of all human beings. That's a little extreme. One doesn't need to, but that centrality of suffering, because you just need to look at human history and you realize that is the one common thread that is running through. And he was the first man to really come to grips with it. Like, okay, let's deal with this. Let's fix this. And not in a extreme manner. That is why he called his path the middle path, that it should not be done with torture, physical torture, emotional torture, mental torture, because that is a bypass. He understood that very easily. You have learned to manage your suffering, or you have imposed your will on your suffering, and now your suffering cannot control you, but that it doesn't really deal with it, doesn't really dissolve it. Whereas if you come to that right state of meditative consciousness, the suffering actually begins to melt. And that is the purpose of the sadhana. That is because, we are all, at the core, we are blissful. Why do we not know that we are blissful? Because of lifetimes of negative experiences, lifetimes of, there are multiple, one day I'll talk about that, what is the difference between happiness and joy and bliss, and there are multiple stages of happiness, there are multiple stages of, they are all different kinds of vibration. I'll talk about it. So his entire approach was very unique, and thank God for that, because the whole world had to deal with that. The whole world had to take on that new approach, that how do we deal with it? Not how do we understand this also, or not why is this happening, but he was like, let's fix it. And today, unfortunately, a lot of sadhanas, a lot of systems, they promise greater effectiveness and efficiency, better health, more sleep. Those are the kind of, nobody ever has the courage to come and say, if you do this, the suffering that you're carrying around will go and you'll actually be a happy person. Yeah, because nobody wants to acknowledge that I also suffer. Dukkham is there in me also. It's a tragedy because, if you can actually let that process, let the sadhana, let the breaths, let the meditation melt away the suffering, you become a much more useful person to the world rather than carrying around this burden. But because that is not good marketing, nobody says it. But actually that, yeah. So much more I can say. I mean, Buddha, so many aspects of his story are interesting, but I thought that the centrality that he gave to suffering and how to overcome it, we should acknowledge it because it is unique. Yeah? Sarvam Shomyam.